Each year, Fairfax Media, on behalf of the Sydney Morning Herald, The Age and the Canberra Times, commissions leading Australian artists to celebrate the people and place, and to also celebrate our national day, Australia Day. This year, our feature artist is Tim Storia, who has painted 3 works especially for each of the newspapers. Each year, we also feature works by leading Australian artists, and this year, those artists include Elizabeth Cummings, Colin Lansley, Michael Johnson, and Mandy Martin, among many others. After the success of last year's project, Stuart Purvis from Australian Galleries has kindly agreed to host the exhibitions in his galleries in Sydney and Melbourne.
There is an incredibly important period of Australian art, post-war art, that on a world scale is really interesting and vital, and probably could only be done in a country of isolation. Drysdale, for me, is the first Australian painter of note that actually began to paint what I call the Australian picture, not looking over his shoulder and borrowing from England. He drew a line from one side of the canvas to the other, unbroken, a view you cannot get in Europe. You could get it in Africa, but you can't get it in Europe or England because it would be broken by some hills, some mountains, or some such thing. He was brave enough to actually take it on without looking backwards. Now, if you jump forward, you come to Tim Storia, 50 years later, he's doing exactly the same thing. And what they're both trying to do is give the emotional history of this country, of what it is, a poetic view of the isolation.
Well, Tim, thank you for agreeing to talk to Fairfax Media today on behalf of the Sydney Morning Herald, The Age and the Canberra Times. This year's Australia Day, the project is loosely titled Wonder, and it really celebrates the place, Australia, and the people. Just wanted to talk to you a bit about what Australia Day means to you, or what this place, Australia, means to you.
Well, I was a little confused, like a lot of people. It doesn't celebrate Federation, it celebrates the landing of the First Fleet, I believe. So from that point of view, I suppose, it's very similar to the American holiday Thanksgiving. So I think it should be treated with some kind of reverence. Admittedly, it means different things to different people. However, it's not all negative and a lot has been achieved. So I think it is something that's worth taking quite seriously and with some reverence.
Well, Gavin Wilson wrote in the catalogue to your recent survey exhibition that the underlying strength in your work is the earth, the air, fire and water. And the works that you have done for the Sydney Morning Herald, The Age and the Canberra Times do celebrate that. Could you talk a little bit about those motifs?
Well, when you're dealing with heat, in this particular case there is heat in the landscape of the sky, etc., and also the heat generated by the imaginary line, if you like, it raises quite interesting and difficult tonal questions that maintain different perspectives and different warmths. I'm attracted to that because of its lushness if you get it right when it's finished. And it really works on a very traditional way of painting, which has got to do with warm colours over cool colours and vice versa to create an interesting surface.
Even though you grew up in a pastoral scene, your work doesn't have that pastoral setting the way, say a Streeton or a Roberts or a Glover. You paint deserts and big skies and with those limitless horizons.
Growing up in the country, I think, has a lot to do with it. I mean, I sort of believe that in a way that you can't really manufacture a painter. I mean, a painter is made essentially a lot of the time by their background. I mean, an example would be Ricker Moore, who grew up by the sea, and you see the references to the sea in a lot of his work. It's very much part of his poetry. And I think, you know, when you're dealing with what I'm doing, I've just inherited what I grew up with or what I thought about. I mean, the influence of comics, especially Western comics, was very big. And in a lot of these things, there was space.
There's a lot of memory in your work.
Memory is very subjective. I mean, to illustrate a point, years ago I had a conversation with Sir William Dargie. Now this would be in the 80s, and he asked me a rather obscure question. He said, did I ever travel by steamer from Melbourne to Sydney? And I said, well, you know, no, of course I didn't. They'd ceased service many years ago. But I asked him why, and he said, well, of course the lines of fire that he recognised in my work reminded him of travelling up the coast and looking west. And of course it was the indigenous people still burning off. He was talking about the 20s. So one of the reasons to approach the question of an image or images for Australia Day, it reminded me of that, so it seemed to have a slightly timeless quality possibly.